This is Caffeinated Risk, the monthly podcast for security professionals by security professionals.
Welcome, folks, to the next podcast from Caffeinated Risk. In this session, we chat with Dr. Jack Freund, Vice President and Head of Cyber Risk Methodology at BitSight. Jack is a leading voice in information risk measurement and management. His corporate experience includes spearheading strategic shifts in IT risk by leading his staff in executing multi-million-dollar efforts in cooperation with other risk and control groups. His academic credentials include being named a senior member of the IEEE and ACM, IAPP Fellow of Information Privacy, Fellow of the FAIR Institute, and Distinguished Fellow of the ISSA. The book Jack co-authored with Jack Jones, Measuring and Managing Information Risk, A Fair Approach, was inducted into the cybersecurity canon in 2016. Jack is ISACA's 2018 John W. Lanehart IV's Common Body of Knowledge Award recipient and was given an ISC Squared Global Achievement Award in 2020. Both Doug and I are huge fans of his work and have referenced his book throughout our careers. So Jack, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being part of the Caffeinated Risk podcast family. So thanks for coming on today.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks so much for being here, and also for the career that you've had in trying to provide the concept of risk to security professionals. I think that's something that I really was impressed with, everything that you've done in your career and how you're trying to get the message of this concept of risk to professionals. And I wanted to start off with that question. There's this great story in the book, and it's the boyfriend story.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about it. So, one of the things that Doug and I found throughout all of our careers is that this concept of trying to explain risk or explain a cyber risk, or to try to get people interested, excited, or at least listening to us when we're talking about cyber risk. And when I reread the boyfriend story, I wanted to ask you, could you help us and the audience? How do you get that message across to executives? How do you get people to listen to the story of risk when you're presenting your findings or going through it?
Yeah, that's a funny story. That's and to be fair, that's not my story. That's the other Jack story. Although typically Jack Jones is Jack and I'm the other Jack. But on this particular podcast, I think it makes sense for him to be the other Jack. That was his story. Yeah, his daughter wanted to visit a man that was a ways away, and I asked him one time. I said, "Well, how, what did your analysis turn up? Were there any what did you do? And he said, "Well, I found some control opportunities." Trying to be a little evasive on purpose there. I think the connection to this, the power of explanatory storytelling is really important. And, for any story to take off, you really have to have a connection to the audience. So understanding who that audience is and the things that they care about and the stories that they may have already known about is really important. And this is where I think, and the origin of my interest in risk and communication of security concerns really started, was trying to find a way to bridge that gap between the security things that we manage and all of the myriad list of controls and threats, and it grows bigger every day. To sort of take that and boil it down to its essence so that you can convey that to executives who are by definition not experts in cybersecurity.
No.
And they need to have this presented to them in a way that is meaningful to them. And I wrote a piece about this, over a decade ago about, these executives are not stupid. Like, they're not idiots because they don't understand cybersecurity. Like, they do genuinely understand their business and their own domains. So we should find a way to sort of stretch into those. And that was what really led me to really better understanding risk quantification and communicating risk that way.
Have you found it changed over the last 5 years or so? Like, as we've seen that threat landscape change during the pandemic, pick a factor that you wanted to take into account. Have you seen it change over the past 5 years or so?
I've said this before that, we spent a lot of time in cybersecurity, trying to get the attention of boards. And the good news is that, especially with the rise in ransomware, the good news is boards are paying attention. And now the bad news is the boards are paying attention. And anytime you have that,
careful what you wish for, right?
100% be careful what you wish for. And when you have that gaze upon you, everything that you do becomes much more amplified. So your ability to tell those stories needs to increase as well. And the decisions that you make and the reasons that you make them need to be well justified. So, it's been 15, 16, 17 years since I really began digging into this space. And I think that the really interesting thing about it is that the amount of people that need convincing that this is the proper way to do it is significantly less than it used to be. So now people will approach with, I got to do this board report, and they ask for some quantification, and I don't know how to do it. Whereas before, you were spending a lot of time telling people that what got you here isn't going to get you there. But now these sort of people are self-acknowledging that they need to level up their skills a little bit to be able to have this risk communication session in a very mature way.
Yeah, and I think the quantifying is definitely the challenge. And I think that's what originally drew me to FAIR. So my Jack story is I have an email from the other Jack asking if I could use his bald tire example in a class I was teaching. And
interesting. Yeah.
so, yeah, by all means, kind of thing. But that example alone opened my eyes, and now if there's no impact, there's no risk.
Right.
We can work it all back from there, but trust me.
Yep.
That's like the thing. There's no risk if there's no impact.
Right.
But the quantifying is where I was kind of going, because you'd mentioned it. And a few years back, I was facing a discussion with a different boss about expert opinions and using that to determine, what the security risk was.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, if you got a range of expert opinions, you could run that through a simulation and come up with a likelihood that way. And it didn't land.
Yeah.
And, obviously I'm on board with Monte Carlo and a range of expert estimates and stuff. But for those that are still looking for more of an actuarial, hard science, air quotes, kind of data on something security like this, how do we do that? And I know we can't create the data that isn't there. If something hasn't happened, it's hard to have data on it. But
right.
How do we bring them around to still measuring?
Yeah. This is a great question, and it's one that's preoccupied me of late and some of the work I've been doing. But let me talk a little bit about this, and I'll back into to your last question there, because the great thing about the bald tire example is that it reveals assumptions that you're making.
Mm-hmm.
When you get to the end, that sort of helps you understand too, like, oh, risk is important because we need loss. But the other fascinating thing about it is, as you work through this, and as I've run FAIR training sessions, this has happened a lot too, you begin to see the assumptions that people are going to make before they make them and sort of recognize them. So in a similar vein, if you think about some of the assumptions that went into the creation of FAIR, one of them was that there wasn't data available to do these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been a valid assumption for a long time. And even though I would take issue with one thing you said, even though S&B calibrated ranges and the statistical methods that go with those are actually actuarial grade methods for doing things. But although that doesn't necessarily feel very satisfying to certain audience members, that seems to be
I was on board. This person wasn't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They wanted engineering tables and, like the melting temperature of steel and things like that,
Yeah, if you're looking for precision, forecasting risk may not be the way to go. Yeah. But what I think too is that I've sort of begun thinking about this from different personas, and I think as an enterprise user of FAIR, trying to understand your own loss exposure, I think there's different methods you would use. And then I sort of look at it from a different perspective, like, oh, if you're an insurance underwriter, or you are working as in the investment community as a credit analyst, or in the capital markets trying to understand investment opportunities, the need for validation and precision changes a little bit. If you've ever experienced purchasing homeowners insurance, an example, they don't necessarily need to send an agent out and look at everything in your home. They're going to make some assumptions about what you own and there's construction, and largely that is based upon public data about your neighbors. So there are some similar things that can be done with the data sets that are available today, and they're significantly better today for cybersecurity losses than they were when FAIR was created. So leveraging those data sets gives you the opportunity to better understand sort of a peer community of losses, and then you can begin to layer in control data too. So I spent a lot of time talking about firmographics and technographics. Your loss within reasonable margins of error can look a lot like others with similar firmographic profiles. And then layering on top of that technographics, where we look at actual control states from a variety of validated data sources. Some have more validity than others, but you still leverage those things to sort of layer in and inform decisions at different types of levels. So I think that's a big tipping point that has happened, probably a couple of years ago, when it's sort of like, hey, I think these data sets are largely reasonable enough in size and scope that we can begin to make some assessments here. And you're seeing this leverage in at scale in some security vendor products have these kind of things baked into them, these sort of industry profiles, but most people can get them for free from a lot of industry reports that organizations put out, nonprofit groups, and some are for-profit. You can find a lot of these industry reports to say, firms in this particular range of firmographic detail tend to have losses that look like this. And that's a good starting point for actually informing your own assessments. So I think it's one thing, and I've experienced this working inside organizations as well, where it was, I was building SME calibrated ranges internally to support cyber insurance purchase decisions. And then I got a similar report from the broker that was helping us with the underwriting. And I was like, wow, look at my range. I was, I was within tolerance on there. I was elated that day. I was like, wow, I actually did this fairly well. So sort of figuring out that peer benchmarking piece of it and then layering in some specifics, I think can bolster those arguments. So it's not, I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it could be supplemented by that, saying, hey, we did an internal exercise and here's what we got. And oh, by the way, here's what this peer industry reports, and you can cite those things, looks like as well. And, we're within or we're outside of this margin because I've considered these extra things that these reports don't consider. So I think there's value in those kind of things too. But I think the proliferation and the availability of this public data is making it a lot easier to present those kind of things. And ultimately, for the satisfaction of the person or persons to whom you're communicating, namely executives and boards, much to my chagrin at the time, they always wanted that peer benchmark anyway. And I couldn't run the same SME calibration exercises on all of our competitors. They wouldn't take my call. And this is one of the ways I think that you can get to that, because everybody wants to know where, how they size up against their peers. And this is a way to enable that.
So I applied the same approach and principles when we were working on a project, but on the physical security side. And we had some amazing results, because it really was the attention that we put first on the data collection and then the trending that we put into place. So I challenged the team that we had, because the scenario was that we were seeing a significant increase in either loss events against property or graffiti events against some of our facilities. We really did. We again, tried all the typical controls, and most of them were either detective at the, after the fact to record the event and terrific. Eventually, maybe law enforcement will look at this if they get really interested in their board, and that's fine. But, I challenged the team to look at things a bit differently and gave them excerpts from the FAIR methodology to take a look at. Can you apply some of this approach and see what you come back with?
Right.
So they did. They took it upon themselves, and they went back and searched 10 years worth of physical event data.
Wow.
And came up with timing patterns that they saw when particular types of events occurred during particular parts of the day over a weekday versus weekend.
Well, like Super Bowl wins or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're not in Buffalo, so I guess I won't call on Buffalo. But anyway, so we had we had some similar problems, and the interesting part is they put in a couple of different controls, and it was amazing because we saw a 45% decrease in recorded events for the next month after.
That's great.
And it was all based on following this methodology. And when they latched onto it and they kept applying this, instead of calling it their tours, right, for guard force facilities, they called it their risk assessments. And that's how they wrote up all of their, that point following was during this risk assessment, we identified this gap in a control. They didn't call it, I found a door unlocked. No, it was a gap in a control.
Right.
It worked, right? And that's what really struck me is that approach worked. Right?
That's valuable because it really changed the way they thought about it too, which is even much more meaningful.
It was. And that to me that's when they really embraced it. And I knew that we'd made that point. But I wanted to ask, as you've trained so many people over the years, when you see that change, how have you seen teams change in their approach, or when they start embracing the principles, but also embrace the approach? Have you seen that type of significant change in some of the groups that you work with in the past 10 plus years?
Absolutely, and it's definitely been there's a natural inclination in a lot of large organizations to silo and to focus on their remit and to the exclusion of somebody else. And I think to be really good at risk assessments, you have to bridge that gap and talk to other people. So I've been in banks in cybersecurity doing assessments, and then going and talk to the physical security people who are sometimes ignored in these types of organizations. They're like, what do you mean nobody ever talks to me about this? We do our rounds, we do our risk assessments, we check things, we lock doors. But to have those conversations with them really pulls them in and connects them. And it's the same way in the other direction when you start thinking about applying these things and gathering data and communicating with business leaders too, and having those sort of conversations. And you learn all sorts of fascinating things, and like just how the business operates, which is a really necessary component and skill set that a lot of cybersecurity people don't have natively, but it's something that you can develop. It's relatively easy. Just have this natural curiosity of how do we make money, and how does money flow through an organization, and how does loss materialize, and what do our customers care about? And it's easy, I think, to become insulated from that in security and in some cases in the broader IT spaces as well. But that really helps bring things together. And your physical security example is really valuable. And I also like physical security. I don't think there's a information or cybersecurity person who doesn't have a thought pattern around physical security as well. But just a quick story. I was helping a friend recently changing out locks on their door. And, we were just digging into the details around, strike plates and, the deadbolt and everything like that. I have my favorite brands and techniques and that kind of stuff, but we're sort of talking about this, and he has a small business. And I sort of said at a certain point, I said, listen, let's not forget that this is all glass here. So if somebody really wanted to get in, they're just going to smash the glass. And he's like, oh yeah, never mind. We don't need to do all these other additional things that would have cost money and time and effort. And I think that's the real value of this too, is sort of understanding that, like in your physical security example, once you sort of raise the bar on a certain area, either it stops completely or it shifts to another entry point. And that's the important thing, I think, is really sort of having those revelatory moments, like, who's really going to do this, or those types of things, or if they were really determined, then wouldn't they just go somewhere else? Or anyway, sort of having those critical questions. I used to say this a lot, that in these sort of analyses, you sometimes have to be a bit of a contrarian. And that's part of those assumptions. Like, everyone goes in assuming everybody cares about security, which is generally true, and everybody wants to have the highest level of security, which is not generally true. So when you go into these conversations, you start sort of asking questions like, would this really happen? And if it did, would it be more or less than if it happened over here? And wouldn't they shift tactics or techniques, or come in a different entry point? And those are important ways to think about it, not necessarily to communicate that you don't care about security and just want to end the meeting early, but to sort of help spur the conversation and have people frankly think about this like they're a criminal. If I was trying to break into my friend's small business, I probably would just do this, or I'd just, tie the door to the back of my car and just, open it that way, in which case it wouldn't matter what I put on the door.
Yeah. And as you're explaining that, it sort of dawning on me, probably because they sent me a reminder that my fees are due, but it's ironic that the hallmark of the cybersecurity skills matrix is the CISSP, and yet I meet very few people in the cyber business that actually understand risk and risk tolerance and costs and that cost benefit analysis that theoretically we're supposed to be advising on and supporting.
That's a good point.
Why is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sort of paging back in my mental Rolodex, another metaphor that young people won't get today. But I'm sort of paging back in my mind of what it was like learning these concepts in the first time. And I remember just thinking, yeah, this makes sort of sense. There's a way to better inform these kind of decisions and work through them. And then you're right, and you get into practice, and it's all around controls frameworks and implementation and elimination of risk all the time. And I wonder too if there's sort of this, and this is a lot of what this gap is a lot of what FAIR was meant to address, and a lot of what the FAIR Institute puts forward in its education and training programs is to sort of help people, and the Open Group too, in the same vein, is to better understand like this distinction between elimination and acceptance, and sort of understanding what that looks like. And I don't know if perhaps those domains. Full disclosure, I spent a lot of time working with ISACA, not with IC Squared, on their certification.
Yep.
So I know a lot about how those certifications are created and managed that way. Less so on the IC Square side, but speaking for ISACA, I understand the way. I mean, I work on the CRISC committees there for many years now, and we've always tried to include quantitative things in there.
Yep.
But I wonder if I had to pin it down as to what the root cause was. I think for years, and you still see this today, which is frustrating, is anytime you read a paragraph around the pros and cons around risk qualification versus risk quantification, the con for the quantification is always like, well, it's really hard to do, and it's, there's no data anyway. So yeah, while you could do these things, it's not really worth doing. Anyway, just sort of pick whether it's high, medium, or low. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't usually say it that way, but that's how I hear it when I read it. I think that's probably it. I think in the same breath is those organizations and those subject matter domains just don't have the ability to get into the depth of those skill sets you need to do this very well. I mean, I've said this for a long time, and I think cyber risk analysis is sort of distinct from other sorts of security work on purpose, because we have a different remit, we have a different domain, we have to think about things a little differently. None of which is bad. I think you need both of those types of thinking on the same teams, but as you move through, especially in very mature risk organizations like you typically see in financial services, when you move into second line of defense, operational risk, ERM type of domains, they're much more willing to accept variance, whereas we in security try to think, and we're trained to think in a very absolute kind of way. We have to assess all the controls and all the ways in, and look at all these frameworks and manage these kind of things. And I think risk sort of has to bridge that gap to understand, like I said earlier, understand how money flows through the organization, and then what's our goals and objectives, what's our mission, and how do these things enable that or imperil it, and finding some priority level for those kind of things. It's a different sort of way of thinking about it, that maybe these certifications just aren't really well designed to better assess your general business knowledge that way. So maybe that's the real answer. Maybe I've sort of just been talking out loud here, is that they're designed to do something different, to make you aware of this concept, but maybe those are still the domain of on-the-job training. I don't know. I
would agree, and I think you summed it up best. You your job as the cyber person is to understand how your company makes money, how they stay open, and let's pretend they're not making money. Let's pretend for a second the government isn't interested in making money. They're there to provide services or something.
Sure. Yep.
Whatever your organizational mission is, how do you do that? And then how does that unravel at a cyber thing? So are you familiar at all with the Idaho National Labs folks and their consequence-informed or the cyber-informed consequence-driven engineering, where they look at the impact and then work backwards?
It's kind of ringing a bell, but I can't say that I'm conversant in it.
Yeah, it's pretty obscure, and only it seems to be more focused on operational things like dams and power plants and stuff, not really for banks. But again, they start with the impact and work backwards, which is very, very helpful.
And I like how you said mission, because I think that's really important. I mean, I always just talk about how money flows to an organization, but I have done work for nonprofits, not-for-profits, and some government work too. And in all of these examples, there's always, something that's important to us to accomplish. I famously worked for one not-for-profit financial services company who is on the Fortune 100 list. And the CEO there used to make me laugh all the time because he would say, "We may be not for profit, but we're also not for loss."
Right on.
Fair.
Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's a good statement, right? So,
and then you also think about the NFL is a not for profit, and they obviously have a lot of money going through that organization. So to say that you can't even do these things if you're not a for-profit company is certainly inaccurate, because like you mentioned, government missions are important too, and if there's a thing you're trying to do and it is imperiled in some way, then that's sort of the same kind of level of thing. Even if you're a straight charity, it's the same kind of thing. There's donors, there's donations, there's missions that you're trying to accomplish. So just understanding what it is we do here, which is a very banal way of describing it, but that's truly what it is what do we do here, and how do we make money? That's really critical for people to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'll tell you what, if all the attackers are trying to understand the best way how money flows through your organization.
Absolutely.
Because they want to either stop that up so that you pay them to unstopper it, or they want to try and break off a piece of that money for themselves.
Yeah. Now, if we could just get them to leave a report as part of that breach, then
yeah, that would help. Right, makes it faster to repair. Right?
It's funny. We have bug bounties. What I really like is if we could just pay attackers to give us a business process map. That would be really great too.
Oh, wouldn't that be awesome? And then just annotate it along the way and where you found it, right? So
That's
then
right,
we just
exactly. Yeah.
To hell with the audit reports. I just want that report, right? That's a lot easier to work with. So.
Because I can clearly see the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. This is fairly straightforward, right there. Yeah. There's no hypothetical here, folks. This is actually, I kind of wanted to ask that. I kind of want to bug you a little bit on that, Jack. Is this idea of, as we educate this concept of acceptance, that's one of the changes we've been seeing. When we talk about ESRM linking to ERM, and ERM being the overarching framework for a company. Me personally, I've seen probably in the last 10 years or so that executives are actually starting to understand that acceptance is part of their job now. Where it wasn't before. I think avoidance was to your point earlier, they just go to the other meeting and not say anything. So, and that doesn't work anymore, right? There's actually this concept of acceptance. And where I've been finding the hardest group to train and to help educate is security professionals. Because for the longest time, we were the crew that said, no, I got this, or we'll fix this, or that's on us. Or, the example I use all the time is Doug and I were working at a company, and I came on board as the CISO. And one of the first meetings I had with the new staff members, they came in and said, "Hi, I just need to review this and sign this." And I went, "Oh, hi, I'm Tim, and who are you? And what are you presenting?" And it was this horrific risk acceptance letter that he was about to sign on behalf of a multi-billion-dollar organization that could have crippled it had something happened. I'm like, no, we don't sign shit. What are you doing with that? That's not our job. Like, our job is to educate and to make people aware and to gain acceptance that way. So when I finally left the organization, they gave me the T-shirt that says, "We're a team, we don't sign shit." But it took a year to get people to realize it's not security that signs off on this stuff, right? It has to be the executives. It has to be the business unit that's sponsoring the risk, the risk review or the risk assessment.
Yeah, that's a great cultural change story there, and I mean, yes, for sure. It's something that is, it's probably a perennial topic in a lot of organizations that are going through these sort of cultural changes. But, I used to have a little aphorism that is, he who owns loss owns risk.
Mm-hmm.
And that really helps you identify the person or persons in the organization that are really responsible for this type of stuff. And I used to have this little thought experiment too, like, let's say that this bad thing happens. And because security signed off on it, we fire the person who signed it. In fact, let's fire the entire department of security and hire a whole new person. Sorry, a whole new team, right? So brand new. Everyone, takes the fall for the whole thing. Well, we're still going to have that loss, and it's still going to play out in the line of business somewhere. And you're going to have these challenges associated with recovering customers or keeping customers. And the reason that's playing out that way is because that's where the loss really is. So those sort of elimination exercises can help you very quickly identify who's the real owner of this. And I used to joke that, you're either signing a check to fix it or you're signing a promissory note to pay for it if it goes wrong. And that's an important way to think about it, especially for those lines of business, because they're on the hook there. I mean, we effectively serve as advisors to our own companies. And I think that's it's a hard place to put yourself in, especially, again, if you're trained in a traditional cybersecurity kind of curriculum to, protect and eliminate stuff. And you get to this point where it's like, I know these things are bad. I know bad things can happen, but we decided not to do it. And I'm okay with that. And that's a bit of it can mess with your head a little bit,
It does. And that's what training folks for the last 10 years or so on the concept of ESRM. It's to watch the mindset in the room go, what? You mean we can, but we have to fix this. But, friend, what if you can't? Like, what if there isn't the budget or the appetite or the mindset within the executive to change it? And, to the point you brought up earlier is that if there's this acceptance of the loss event, should it occur, based on the work that you've done through the FAIR methodology, and you realize here's the numerical value, we can accept that. Now, the cybersecurity professional, you actually have to accept that.
That's a good point, actually.
That's where I struggled with, is trying to get that point across, right? So that's where I found the biggest struggle. And still, to this day, it's still getting folks to realize that, look, if you've gone through the entire methodology and you've come up with the value and the business accepts it, your job's done now. Move on.
Now, I mean, as important as that is, I think you're right 100%. That's where this monitoring aspect of this plays out too. And I have a friend who just gave me an amazing metaphor that I'm planning on using when the time is right, and I'll share it with you and with your audience. And that is, he was just doing an analysis of some systems, and he discovered Windows Server 2003 systems that were operating, and he's like, okay, we got to do something about this. And they're like, oh, we can't, because there's critical business applications that we can't upgrade and generate lots of revenue. And he said, listen, how old is the iPhone in your pocket? And I was like, this is a great question to help people understand the importance of technical debt. Like, you upgrade your iPhone one every year, every other year. This server is 20 years old. We have to do something about it. And so there is that sort of balance of, and that's where monitoring comes into play. Like, risk acceptance, totally fine, but let's just keep this on the list and monitor this and review it, and chalk one up to technical debt there and make sure that doesn't go away, because risk acceptance doesn't necessarily mean that we ignore it. It means we have to monitor it. So I think, though that's probably something that can help people better understand and personally process if they don't choose to do the most secure thing.
When you're working with a client, how do you find the right way, or what is your preferred way of helping them understand they've reached that point of diminishing returns?
That's a good question. I mean, I think this probably is a little more natural and easier for me because of the type of work that I'm doing in the security space, namely sort of understanding trade-offs and understanding loss that way. It is a challenging problem, and likely because I don't want to speak for everybody, but I would imagine that if you want to secure all the things, if you want to work towards elimination, feeling any friction against that is going to be very difficult to really sort of process, as we've mentioned. I think I like to help people understand that diminishing return through metaphors and through storytelling, and really sort of moving that focus towards what happens and what do we do. And I think that earlier story I shared about my friend's door and his lock in a small business with the strike plate issues, we were about to go down a deep rabbit hole when it was very revelatory for him to be like, oh, but they'll just kick in the door, or they'll just, break the glass, or they'll just, because, he's had one of his businesses done that way, and he had to actually put bars on that other business because the material in that particular business that he was protecting had a much higher value than this other one. So that was really helpful for him to sort of, and there was that click, like, oh, you're right, never mind, this isn't important. But that's really around digging and unveiling the assumptions that they have in it, and that was his perspective. He was assuming worst case scenario without necessarily factoring in asset value that way. I mean, and these asset values are a little bit different. It depends on the scenario. Like I always remind my wife, who is probably handled more than her share of my TDM with respect to risk analysis and security. But
so holidays are fun, is what you're saying.
but there is a certain asset value to a feeling that you have in a space and being secure there that I try to remind her of. Like, you would feel violated if somebody came in here, and even if they did nothing, it would be worth the expense for this kind of thing. And there's certain cases like that. I think there's I think it plays out differently in corporate America. That's when you start talking about things like reputational risk and the sort of media harm versus actual loss, which sometimes can be very different. But so I think that's part of that as well, is sort of digging into those assumptions and helping people understand. And it's difficult sometimes for people to imagine all the things that could happen. So enumerating those kind of things and helping them see those things, I think, is very helpful to figuring out that it's not worth the effort for these things, but it is worth the effort here, and here's why we want to focus on that. So,
yep, absolutely. This is the perfect place to end it, I think, for the podcast today. So, Jack, thanks so much for being part of our session today. I really appreciate it. This was a great session. I'm looking forward to getting this to our audience. So, thank you for being here today. So,
good. Well, thank you both for having me. I really enjoyed it, and it was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the latest podcast from Caffeinated Risk. Make sure you visit our website, caffeinatedrisk.com, to stay up to date on what we've been working on. Our website has bios of our podcast guests, posts about topics we're passionate about, and even a library of reference material we find valuable in the work we do every day. And don't forget to subscribe to Caffeinated Risk on your favorite podcast service. This way, you'll be notified when we release our next podcast, and you can listen to our previous guests just in case you missed them. Thanks so much for listening to Caffeinated Risk.